remember how a few times I've said this in the lead up to this class in the last couple of weeks. There are a couple of big um, things we need to always keep in mind for this period. And the first is, of course, the invention of the cotton gin, which is an 18th century invention, but really gets going in the 19th century, makes combing cotton, getting rid of the seeds much more easy, much more mechanical, much more efficient. So cotton suddenly becomes an extremely inexpensive commodity to use for the production of cloth, and this helps not only spread the cotton industry and the cotton weaving industry and the textile mill industry dramatically. It of course means that slavery expands dramatically because all cotton in North America, almost all cotton in North America, is produced in the South, and an awful lot of it is produced by slave labor. So at exactly the time when some of the founding generation thought that slavery might be dying, or that slavery might be sort of eventually on its way out or on the gradual decline to die, it is revived by the cotton gin. The second invention is later. It's more in the period we're talking about, and that is the invention of the steel skeleton or steel infrastructure of buildings. This is really boring. This sounds really boring, and it's a very Pittsburghy thing to talk about. But essentially, what it is what people are able to do with steel, which is lighter and stronger than masonry, is build an interior skeleton of buildings made of steel, and then the exterior is made of bricks or stone or whatever, but that exterior is very, compared to the way they used to be, the exterior is very thin compared to building a house straight up from the foundation up, made of bricks or stone. And this meant that buildings could be built much higher. And this is where we see where sort of towns, some big towns, turn into really what we think of as modern cities now, and small towns turn into larger towns. There's a possibility of doing much more commerce in town, and also therefore, and the ability to pack these, for lack of a better word, skyscrapers together means that a lot more business can be concentrated. It's a very big development. It also means that plantation owners can maintain themselves on their plantations out in the country in more disconnected but also connected ways. The town becomes more important as an entrepot of commerce, and the trading of whatever commodity, slave, cotton, sugar, tobacco, cotton, sugar. Okay, but you're making all this money from the town, but you're able to spend it and live outside on the plantation. So you get these massive plantations like Arlington and stuff like that in this period. And the third thing just to remember is, don't fall into this trap that a lot of us fall into, including me, that the North is sitting by idly while all this is going on, and the North is full of anti-slavery people, full of firebrand abolitionists and stuff like that. Well, almost all the cotton textile mills are in the North because they're becoming industrialized by this period. Massachusetts is just chock full of textile mills, and upstate New York is chock full of textile mills. And so the northern businessmen are profiting tremendously off of southern slave-produced cotton. Okay? So there is an interest for northern business interests to keep slavery going. Not necessarily keep slavery going, because a lot of them, it's one of these tremendous human contradictions. People carry around all these contradictions within themselves. A lot of big cotton cloth producers were abolitionists, but they're used to getting the cotton in a certain way, at a certain price, a certain volume. Okay, and if you were to tinker with that, let's say abolish slavery, let's say January 1st, 1850, the competitive cotton market, the having to import or create a competitive cotton market in the South would have taken some time, and there would have been disruptions, and it would have been uneven, the flow of cotton. So there are a lot of people who are definitely in the North who are definitely profiting off slavery, and who, in the back of their mind, don't mind profiting off slavery. So it's not a complete North-South divide. That starts to grow later on. Okay. So this is very, very important to remember that these three things are going on. Just one second. I have to do a massive cough. I'll be right back. Okay, where was I? All right. But where does all this start? This all starts in the Old South, and the idea that cotton is king. Cotton replaced sugar as the world's major crop that was produced by slave labor in this 19th century. And we're talking about now 1815 to 1840, 1850. And of course, the strength of American slavery rested on cotton. 3/4 of the world's cotton supply came from the southern United States. And by the way, later on in the 19th century, the screw propeller is invented, and you can have this sort of steamships and things like that. And the paddle wheel steamer is outdated. But one thing cotton actually, and the increase in production of cotton boosts, is the production of sails. Sails, as you know, are massive pieces of cloth, and sailcloth itself has to be of a certain type of cotton, very strong, very sturdy. Well, if there's a brief sort of burst in the number of ships being built, because you can now start to have a lot of sailing ships, whereas before you couldn't. The growth in cotton also helps produce the growth in durable work clothes. Some people argue that the gold rush in California wouldn't have happened without denim jeans, which of course made of cotton, made of very thick, heavy cotton, very hard wearing, and all that sort of thing. And those things have all these subsidiary industries that grow up with them. So the sails, right, require grommets to to lash them to hoist them, or whatever they call it, to up the mast. Levi's jeans, if you will, even to this day, have little rivets in them, right? They probably don't need them anymore, but they have them. Well, this was one of the things in the 19th century. So cotton has an increase in cotton production leads to an increase in cotton cloth, which leads to an increase in all these sort of subsidiary industries that support that. It just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows. Okay? The cotton in the U.S. is not only, cotton in the South is not only sent to textile mills in the North, but also to Great Britain. Great Britain, and in fact, in the north of Great Britain and in southern Scotland, because there's a lot of water power, a lot of river power. There's just an explosion in the number of textile mills. And you have in Britain, even though Britain abolishes the slave trade in 1807, eventually abolishes slavery in 1833 in the British Empire, it's the British business interests are making a ton of money off American cotton, and therefore making a ton of money off of American slavery. Cotton is America's most important export. Okay, well, by 1860, it represented over half of the U.S. exports worldwide. Okay. Now, as I say, the slave trade is banned in 1807 by the British Empire. It's enforced by the British Navy, enforced pretty well by the British Navy, and but also the Constitution bans it. The U.S. bans it in 1820 because it said that it's actually in the Constitution the slave trade is allowed to exist for a certain period, but that doesn't mean that the supply of slaves goes down. In fact, the supply of slaves goes up because of what's called natural increase. Slaves in the United States produce more slaves through breeding. There were more than 2 million slaves sold from 1820 to 1860 within the United States, okay, not being imported from Africa. Okay. And as I mentioned, these towns becoming cities and these cities becoming places of intense commerce and highly concentrated commerce. Well, the offices of slave traders expand. There are big auction houses for slavers for auctioning off slaves. There are public slave markets, right? It becomes a very big and concentrated commodity. Slaves themselves become a literal commodity. Okay, so this is what people call the second Middle Passage. Is not the Middle Passage between Africa and the North American continent, but the Middle Passage between where you were born and where you were ultimately taken to be sold, and where you then moved on by your new owner. So slaves are moving a tremendous amount. And just to reiterate what I said, it shapes the lives of all Americans. Northern merchants and manufacturers obviously participate in the slave economy and shared as profits. Ships, as I mentioned before, banks also, we always forget banks and insurance and things like that are very important. And because there's a lot more money going around, there's a lot more sort of money management needed, and these things become modern industries of their own. Now, having said all that, and having said how important the cotton and slavery are to the North as well as the Southern economy, the Southern economy is fundamentally different from the Northern economy. Okay, now I don't like to do this because generally speaking, movies are terrible indicators of what actually happened in history. But there's an interesting scene in the early stages of Gone with the Wind. I don't know if you've seen Gone with the Wind. It's one of these movies that history professors hate with a passion because it's so it glorifies the old South. It has all these obedient, plantation loving slaves on it. It's about as ahistorical as it can get. But there is this scene early on after the war breaks out, or the war is starting to break out, or the Fort Sumter is fired on. I can't remember exactly. And all these planter men, all these the sort of elite men of the area are all gathered in at Tara, the house that the O'Haras owned, the plantation the O'Haras owned. And they're sitting there all with all this fervor, all this Southern pride. We're going to whip those Yankees. We're going to beat them. Southern men are better officers. They're more gallant. They're more gentlemanly. They're better fighters. They have they have a stronger ideological commitment to their cause, right? It's for the tradition, the way of life. Northerners are just dirty money men. You know, we're going to defeat them like we would defeat an army of robots. And this goes around. Lots of people are saying this, and it's a sort of a rabble-rousing crowd in Mr. O'Hara's big parlor. And off to the side, Rhett Butler, paid by Clark Gable, says, "Well, yeah, but remember, guys, that there are, I don't know, 50 cannon factories in the North. There are none in the South. There are all sorts of shipwright companies in the North. We only have a few in the South. Bullet manufacturers are common in the North. They're not common in the South. Rifles come from Springfield, Massachusetts in overwhelming numbers. They don't come from Springfield, Mississippi, if there even is a Springfield." He takes this line of argument that, yes, we may have sort of manliness and ideology on our side, but the North has got the industry. Now, I don't know that whether there were zero cannon manufacturers in the South, or zero cannon factories. But it's not a bad way to think about the differences between the North and South. There were fewer larger cities in the South, even though there's this transformation that I talked about. The cities were mainly centers for gathering and shipping cotton and dealing with slave trading. They did not necessarily move into manufacturing in any great degree. Certainly not really in an export way, the way a lot of northern cities had. New Orleans, by the way, is the most important city in New Orleans is the only city of significant size in the South. Is the only city that really has this sort of structure, the sort of flow of commerce, the sort of flow of business, the way New York does in the North. Okay, both port cities, both dealing with a lot of different countries. A lot of things are exported from New Orleans and imported from New Orleans, but that's really the only place. And New Orleans is very diverse. There's obviously French culture there, Caribbean culture, but it's also sort of moving stuff from New Orleans into the rest of the South is harder than it is to move from New York to other places in the East, okay, in the North. Okay, so New Orleans is the only city of any decent size in the South, but it's not as powerful, as efficient as New York and Boston and Philadelphia. Okay. So this is a problem. The cities in Virginia, the cities in South Carolina and Georgia are tiny by comparison, and this means that they're not going to work as well in what becomes perhaps the first industrial war. The South produces less than 10% of the nation's manufactured goods. Pardon me. Now, having said all that, and having given you the idea that the South is based almost exclusively on cotton and slavery, and by that I don't mean to forget sugar and tobacco, but there are a couple of important caveats. 3/4 of white Southerners didn't own any slaves. Okay, most white Southerners lived on sort of self-sufficient farms. Okay, self-sufficient. They were feeding themselves and trading with their sort of immediate neighbors. They weren't really integrated into the market economy. That's one of the reasons why the South didn't develop much industry. Now, even though most whites didn't own slaves, they supported slavery. Okay. There's this sort of bond in the South. There's a very interesting, complicated relationship between groups of men in the South. It's absolutely fascinating to read about. There's a sort of bond in the South over race between white men, poor white men, and rich white men. Lots of poor white men, like Andrew Johnson, who become president after Lincoln dies, are very against the planter class. They don't like this hierarchical English aristocratic sort of structure that exists in the South, but they're still pro-slavery. Okay, so they support the idea of a slave society, even though they might hate the slavery elite. So, for instance, that in the way that some people in the United States, a guy working in a gas station hates the fact that Jeff Bezos has $85 billion or $800 billion or whatever he has, that he didn't pay any taxes last year, whatever the story is. But he hates that, but he doesn't hate capitalism. Okay? Very firmly, very strongly believes in that. So most white Southerners support the slavery because there's this sort of shared bonds of regional loyalty, racism, and kinship ties. And they also see, as I talked about last week, a sort of growing abolition movement in the North. And there's a natural pushback. Wait a minute, don't tell us what to do about how we run our economy. Okay, so even though this is one of the great tragedies of the South, poor Southern white farmers are not only not profiting in slave produced cotton the way the rich elites are, but because of all these reasons, they bought into the story that slavery is a good thing, even though slavery kind of works against them and their own interests. This is a very common thing in history. European history is full of this sort of crap. People being convinced of stuff, of a large ideology that actually hurts them in their daily lives. Anyway, even in the slave owning class, though, the number of slaves per family is pretty small. Most slave holding families only earned 5 slaves or fewer. Sorry, I misphrased that. Well, vast majority of slave owning families own 5 or fewer slaves. There are only about 2,000 families in the South that own 100 slaves or more. But owning slaves and owning lots of slaves, and particularly inheriting slaves, was a way to wealth, status, influence. So all the people in the state assemblies, the state legislatures in the South, almost all of them are major slave owners. Certainly all the congressmen and senators from the South are major slave owners. If I have this right, the first 5 presidents, 4 of them are major slave owners for Virginia, and Jackson. 5 out of the first 7 were slave owners. So the only 2 non-slave owners were John Adams, the second president, and John Quincy Adams, the 6th president, from Massachusetts. So they have an outsized influence on the national stage. Slavery is very profitable. The slave owners, they look at market prices in cotton. They're dealing heavily in dollars and cents. That almost all slave owners, so obviously, big plantation owners obviously had lots of overseers and accountants and things like that to work for them. But the slave, the master of the plantation, he's going through the books. They're paying attention to market news from London, market news from New York, market news from Philadelphia, and on and on and on, and paying attention to their costs and everything. And this is a terrible sort of thing to be happy that there's so much information because of slavery, but historians are able to look into the nature of slave plantations and how they operated to a tremendous degree, because so many incredible amounts of detail were kept. I mean, they're paying attention. They believe this is a good system, and they want to make sure that they're making as much money as they possibly could. Plantation mistresses cared for 6 slaves. They oversaw the domestic servants. Some of those were slaves, some of those weren't. Some of them were slaves, some of them weren't. And they supervised the plantation when the master was away. Now, this is important because in an age of increasing professionalism, right, in the North has this period of sort of professional qualifications, not necessarily college degrees but sort of apprenticeships and things like that prove that you're a good bookkeeper, prove that you're a capable banker, prove that you're a capable printer, whatever. That sort of stuff starts to matter more than actual family ties when it comes to a business person. So a business person in the North is just as likely to hire a pro from outside the family as he is to hire his nephew, just because he's his nephew. That's not the case in the South. In the South, there are these professionals, there are accountants and all this stuff, but an awful lot of them are family members. And more importantly, when the master of the plantation goes off to Richmond to the Virginia Assembly, or goes off to Washington for the U.S. Congress or whatever, it's the mistress of the house. It's the highest ranking family member who takes care of the plantation. Not necessarily who works the accounting or works the books, but when when James Madison is away, any big issues that come up, his wife deals with them. Okay. Maybe not, like I said, the detail stuff, the sort of mechanical stuff, but there's some policy decision, if you will, have to be made. It's done by a family member. That's an extremely important difference, and it only increases as the North starts to move further and further towards a professional society. Don't get me wrong. There's plenty of family nepotism in the North. There are plenty of firms where people hand down their stuff from father to son, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's much more common in the North to have a family hierarchy. Okay? This is why they believe very strongly in this hierarchical agricultural agrarian system. Okay, they also start to convince themselves that, for instance, like, I'm the father of this plantation. I'm not just the master and the owner. I'm the father. I'm responsible for everybody on it. I'm responsible for my slaves, even though they buy and sell slaves as if they're machines and tools, and just horrible dehumanization of them. Slave plantation owners believe in increasing intensity that they are the sort of parents of everything they survey, so to speak. And this helped build up this idea, especially among Southern men, a Southern code of honor. There's still dueling in the South, which is outlawed in almost every northern state. It's either outlawed or basically just doesn't happen anymore. One of the reasons the duel between Alexander and Hamilton and Aaron Burr was so famous is because they had to, dueling was banned in New York. They had to go to New Jersey to do it. And not only is it because these two guys were famous, so well known and important, so it's an important event that they're trying to shoot each other. Dueling was rare in the North. Well, it's not so rare in the South. Okay. But perhaps the biggest thing for our purposes really is to try to understand how the pro-slavery argument intensifies during this period. Remember how I've talked many times as the class has gone on. The 18th century Southern mind, especially the planning elite, especially the intellectuals like Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and Washington, believed that slavery was sort of a necessary evil. Well, we're bothered by it, intellectually bothered by it. They don't actually bother to change the way they behave, but in the back of their mind, their conscience, or they say their conscience plagues them. There's a big debate about how true that is, especially in the case of Thomas Jefferson. But it's the way things are. It's the way things always have been. The whole South is built on slavery. It's this necessary evil. Well, that changes after this, after the cotton gin, and after all these innovations make slavery enormously more profitable. Right? It doesn't. No one in the pro-slavery part of the South anyway sees slavery as on its way out or on a slow decline to oblivion. They see it as growing, and therefore they kind of built up this own justification that it's a good thing. Okay, it's not a necessary evil; it's a positive thing. Slavery is what made Rome great. Slavery is what made Egypt great. Built these great empires, and on and on and on. So there's of course a great deal of white supremacy. There's some biblical sanction. Remember, the Bible is sort of 50-50 on slavery. Half the time it's complaining about the Israelites in bondage. The other half of the time is talking about, well, the slave has to be obedient to its master and other stuff. There's a real problem for Christians in the Bible when they're dealing with slavery, if they want to follow the Bible in a sort of literal sense, fundamentalist sense. Sorry. Okay. But it's really this historical precedent for slavery, and the fact that slavery through these 2 or 3 generations that we're talking about seems to be growing in importance and growing in profitability and making all these other things possible. That's saying, well, it's bad, but it's not just bad, but it's one of these things you have to live with. It's good. The University of Virginia is built on slavery, slave profits and whatever. So it's because of slavery we're allowed to have this huge, great Enlightenment institution, and on and on and on. And another thing that pro-slavery people start to argue is that slavery, if it does nothing else, it means a sort of equality for whites. Yes, sure, most white people in the South don't own slaves. Most white people in the South are small planters. Most people in the South are self-sustaining farmers or community-sustaining farmers. They're not really interested in it, but they are above Black people. They are free, and they are not they're not slaves. They're free, and therefore their freedom makes them equal with other whites. Okay, slavery, because of the cotton gin, was modern in many ways. It was in tune with the times. The slavery owners, we tend to forget this completely in American history because we forget about everything south of Florida. Slavery owners, slave plantation owners communicated extensively with slave owners in the Caribbean, in Cuba and Brazil and places like that, because of this sort of similar sort of feeling, a similar background. A great number of Confederates, by the way, in the 1850s, people become Confederates. In the 1850s, they're talking about, well, wait a minute, we should form an American South that includes the Caribbean, right, and some of Central America, because after all, we're all slave-owning people. That's the defining thing in our lives, and they're able to use their power within the federal government to make sure that slavery isn't really tinkered with. The fugitive slave law is passed early on in the century, and it is enforced very quickly, very strongly. As you know, the House of Representatives is southern states are overrepresented in the House of Representatives because of the 3/5 clause. The fact that there are 2 senators from every state, doesn't matter if you're practically nobody lives in your state or whatever, means that a lot of small southern states, Georgia, have 2 senators, whereas a large state, New York, only has 2 senators. These are all things that make the South sort of by new tradition. The new tradition is going to make the South more influential in the federal government than it would be based on population. This is still true. And by the way, before, just let me make sure to drop this one thing in. You often hear that the Senate is a relic of slavery. The reason why every state, no matter how small or big it is, has 2 senators is because the slave states wanted to make sure they had enough, the same number, that all states were equal in that regard. Well, that's technically not true. What the real reason is because all states wanted to make sure they had equal representation in the Senate. Whether you were a small state or a big state, it had to do much more with your size than with how much than when you were slave or free. New Hampshire's tiny, for instance. So but of course it demands 2 senators. Rhode Island's very small, but it demanded 2 senators way back when. So it's not technically true that the Senate is built on slavery. In fact, if anything, the House of Representatives is more built on slavery than the Senate. But I digress somewhat. Although I just hear that a lot in the media, and because they're talking about the filibuster, and yes, the filibuster is a relic of Jim Crow, right? But that does not necessarily mean the Senate was founded in the way I just described. Where was I? Okay, so these are all the kind of promotions of the pro-slavery argument. These are kind of the ways slavery in which slavery is protected in the South and maintained in the South. Now, what about abolition? It wasn't about the anti-slavery movements. Well, between 1800 and 1840, slavery was abolished in most Spanish America, abolished in the British Empire. That's the Caribbean I'm talking about, right? So that the 1833 slavery's ended in the British Empire. That's 1833, 1838. There's this sort of apprenticeship period, long story. And this changes the Southern this changes the Southern justification for thinking, a justification for slavery in many ways. What happens is in the British Empire, in the Caribbean especially, sorry, this is the third lecture of the day, and the throat is really getting bad. I still have this damn flu. In the Caribbean, after 1833, the sugar trade suffers. The profitability of the sugar trade goes down, and slavery proponents in the United States, well, look, you know, you abolish slavery. Look what happens. Your economy goes down the tubes. Okay? So obviously that's a bad thing. Okay. The other argument that abolitionists make is, yes, that's only a temporary thing, because you're freeing slaves. You're also creating all these new markets, because slaves then will become eventually, the hope is, consumers and purchasers in their own right. So anyway, the abolitionism is not only a moral drive, but there are economic drives, and there are international drives. There's this problem that Americans have at this time, where that a lot of countries are very wary of trading with the United States. They trade with the United States. They do trade with it, but they don't like a lot of the fact that a lot of their textiles and everything were produced by cotton. They don't like the fact, American cotton. They don't like the fact that American or Caribbean or slave sugar is used to sweeten their tea or whatever. There's whole movements in Britain and in Europe about they're the anti-saccharides, for instance. These are people who boycott sugar in their tea, boycott sugar in their coffee, because the slave produced sugar, and that's morally wrong. So they take their coffee unsweetened, and on and on and on. There are people who try. There are all sorts of. You have this weird sort of juxtaposition of these northern English cotton manufacturers, textile manufacturers, who are also themselves anti-slavery. They want to build. They want to be textile manufacturers, but they want that to be based on free labor cotton rather than slavery. And they increasingly pressure Parliament for tariffs, for other things to try to restrict slavery, diplomatic pressure to restrict slavery in the United States. So that there's an awful lot of pressure internationally and nationally against slavery in the South. Now I'm going to have to stop it here after half an hour or 40 minutes, whatever, because my throat really is giving out. But one of the things I want to stress, and there'll be more about this in the recorded lecture that I'll upload later, all of these pressures against slavery from the North, from international spheres of influence, they just harden the resolve of the Southern white attitude towards slavery. Okay, this just makes, see, on the one hand, Southern planters are making a fortune off of slavery. Small Southern white farmers who don't make money off slavery, but feel a racial kinship with planters, feel that their lifestyle and their traditions, their way of lives are being threatened. And this intensifies during this whole period. That's why you get these whacked out radicals like Jefferson Davis, who say the most outrageous things in defense of slavery by the time the Civil War breaks out. I mean, they really do believe that Jefferson Davis is, I don't know this for certain, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if Jefferson Davis's grandfather was uneasy about slavery, had these sort of competing notions in his head about slavery, in the same way that Thomas Jefferson did. Well, but Jefferson Davis is just an out and out racial eugenicist, racial purist. He just, in other words, there's a sort of not only lack of progress, but things go backwards in terms of racial relations, and things get strengthened in terms of the belief in the morality of slavery because of all these things um, um, coming in and sort of bombarding slavery. White Southerners get very paranoid about this. So they're constantly under this worry that we're smaller than the North, we're not as economically powerful as the North. The Northerners are not only busy in their factories, but they're busy doing their moralizing. We don't like a lot of these spiritual things that are happening and these religious revivals and reform movements in upstate New York, a lot of which are abolitionists. We need to, and I don't want to say they sit down and say and have a meeting like the people that did it, Tara, in the movie Gone Within. They don't sit down and have a meeting, say, okay, now we need to come up with more justifications for slavery. It's just this kind of natural reaction. There's a fear that their way of life or their beliefs system is being threatened, and so they react against it. And the reaction they take is to increase the belief in slavery beyond a logical and economic point. There's a point by the late 1850s where you can argue very clearly that sugar, especially, could be just as cheaply produced with free labor as anything else, and that. But then the sugar plantation owners don't rebel. They eventually they rebel, but they react by saying, no, slavery is a positive good. We must have this racial hierarchy. But I'm going to stop in order to be able to record your recorded lecture with the pictures and everything right there. Any questions or concerns or problems? No? Okay, well, Joe, I will solve this problem we're having with your grade on that assignment 1, and your discussion agenda is up. The podcast, which you've been assigned for this week, is up on Canvas. So I will see all of you on Thursday. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay.